So just very quickly, if you don't know much about the Financial Times, we are a global news organisation. So some of you may have seen pink newspapers in newsagents at ft.com. It's read by people around the world. More than half of our readership is outside of the UK. We don't just report on financial topics. We cover all sorts of stories. And one thing that you can probably guess is that data has become much more important to the world of reporting in recent years. If you think of things like the COVID pandemic, all of the elections that we've been whizzing through in recent years, not to mention financial markets and all of that sort of core coverage for the FT. Data literacy is really important to our readers and to our journalists. So we have a dedicated visual and data journalism team. There's about 35 people, most of whom are based here in London. We have a few in New York. We have one in Hong Kong, that's where our 3 main newsrooms are. And it's a big interdisciplinary team. So that's the first thing I was going to say. My undergraduate is not in maths and it's not in journalism. My background is in geography and GIS. Ollie, you told me your undergraduate is English literature, but now you're a computational data scientist. Johnny,
I did maths.
You did maths. So we have one maths here. But actually, there's something really interesting about planning your future careers from this point onwards. There's 2 things to reflect on. One is that increasingly some of the best and most interesting work will be in interdisciplinary teams. That's where you're working with people with completely different skill sets to you. And those skill sets can complement each other and allow you to do work that is greater than the sum of its parts. That's definitely what we're aiming to do at the FT. The second thing is, many of the jobs that we now have in the newsroom didn't exist when I was a student. In fact, every job that I've had since I graduated didn't exist before I was a student. Right? So I joined the FT as a data visualization editor. That was the first time they'd had one, right? I'm now the head of visual and data journalism. You guessed it, that's the first time that role has existed as well. So there's a lot of change and opportunities kind of evolving for careers in this sort of interdisciplinary space. And I hope that the projects that Ollie and Johnny will show you this evening will maybe set some ideas rolling for you and some thoughts. So enough from me. We're going to do 2 sessions. One is going to be a presentation from Ollie. The other one is going to be a presentation from Johnny. We will then do a Q&A at the end. So please keep those questions in, fresh in your mind, and we'll make sure there's time for that at the end. Great. So Ollie, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm Ollie Hawkins. I'm an editorial data scientist in Alan's visual and data journalism team at the Financial Times. I'm also part of a specialist investigations team that uses computational methods to find stories in large data sets. Those methods can include machine learning and other kinds of statistical models, but getting the information we need to tell a story is more important, comes first, and the method comes second. And the work I'm going to show you this evening is more, to be honest with you, computer science and computational data analysis than it is maths. But I'm guessing in a room full of mathematicians, there will at least be some people who are interested in computers for their own sakes. Before I go any further, I also want to point out that the work I'm going to show you this evening isn't exclusively mine. It was done in collaboration with my colleague Edie Hemingway. Unfortunately, she can't be here this evening, but she's asked me to send her apologies. So I guess the kind of key point I want to use this presentation to communicate is that if you are willing to grapple with the technical complexity of data sources that are too daunting for most other data journalists, you can get some really great stories that are exclusive to your newspaper. And the data source that I want to tell you about this evening is blockchain data. In 2025, at the start of this year, we had no capability for doing in-house analysis of blockchain data. That's changed substantially during the course of the year, and I think we've got certainly the best capability of any news organisation in the UK, and I think we're certainly competitive with the best ones in the US. And it all started with this simple question, which came from our editor, Ruler, who wanted to know how much money did Donald Trump make selling his news. Now, if you look at the background to this story very quickly, back in January, on January the 17th, I think it was, or 18th, sorry, 2 days before his inauguration, Donald Trump launched a cryptocurrency called Trump Coin. A particular kind of cryptocurrency called the meme coin, which has no intrinsic value, it's not backed by anything, its role is purely speculative. People buy it because they are sympathetic towards what it represents. And as meme coins go, it was incredibly successful. Its price peaked at just under $75 a token, and it's now subsequently crashed, and it's now about $7.50 a token this morning, so a tenth of what it was. But as meme coins go, $7.50 a token is stratospheric. Most meme coins don't get more than, if you can get fractions of a cent, you're doing pretty well. So he launched this meme coin, sold a bunch of it, and nobody knew how much money he'd made from it. So what I'm going to show you this evening is how we've worked out the answer to this question. And in order to explain that, I'm going to have to try and give you a technically accurate and sufficiently detailed explanation of blockchain data for you to understand what we did. And I'm willing to concede right now this may be a mistake, because in about 10 minutes' time I'm going to sound like this. But there's really no other way of answering the question, how did you do this, which is the question we keep getting asked, without getting stuck into the detail. So if you bear with me for like 10 to 15 minutes, we'll go through some technical stuff, and then at the end there'll be a payoff, and you'll get to find out, first, after you found out how we did it, you'll find out what we learned and why it was worth doing it in the first place. Okay, so let's start with the components of modern blockchains. And when I say modern blockchains, I'm talking about really everything after Bitcoin. Ethereum was the first big one that came along after Bitcoin, and it introduced a new dimension to blockchains that Bitcoin didn't have, which is support for multiple tokens on the same chain. And that's really what defines these kind of second generation blockchains. So everything I'm talking about is about the second generation blockchains. We're going to focus mainly on Solana, but the things that we've done on Solana, we've also done on Ethereum, compatible chains, and on Tron, which is Ethereum-like. Okay, so these are the four key components. Accounts, which represent ownership of data. Tokens, which represent units of value. Tokens can be fungible or non-fungible. We're only going to be talking about fungible tokens, which are coins. Programs. So this is a really key thing to understand, is that modern blockchains aren't just systems for producing ledgers of financial transactions. Modern blockchains are platforms for the deployment of software. So you have native functionality built into the blockchain, but any third party can write a custom program that can be deployed on the blockchain to provide the service. They're often, in the Ethereum context, they're known as smart contracts. But they're basically just code that you can deploy onto the blockchain. And then you have instructions, which are the particular things that programs can do. So each program has a set of instructions that it can execute and that will change account data in specific ways. So to give an example of what this looks like conceptually, the most fundamental operation on any blockchain is transfer, to move a token around. So you'll have a program that has an instruction called transfer that can move a given amount of token T from account A to account B. But you might also have a more sophisticated instruction to do something a bit more complicated, like a swap. So here we have the swap instruction, which is moving a certain amount of token 1 from account A to account B in exchange for token 2. But if you think about it for a moment, a swap is just two transfers. And that's important to understand for two reasons. The first is that one instruction can wrap another instruction or trigger another instruction, and that's going to come up again in a moment. So you can have high-level instructions that decompose into lower-level instructions. The second thing is that for a swap to be trustworthy, these two things either have to succeed or fail together. You can't have the first transfer succeed and the second transfer fail, otherwise the swap has failed and someone has benefited and someone has lost. So you need a way of packaging up instructions so that they either succeed or fail as a whole, and those are what are known as transactions. So you can see the way a transaction is structured is program, instruction, program, instruction, program, instruction. And just bear in mind, as I was saying earlier, that one program's instruction not only can trigger other instructions, one program's instruction can call another program to trigger its instruction, and that's called cross-program invocation. And that will again prove to be very important in terms of understanding the data that we need to understand. But the key thing is this idea of the transaction, this kind of self-contained recipe, which represent kind of atomic units of change that will take place on the blockchain. So the way that you see the transactions of the blockchain network is you have some crypto software running locally, you have something called an RPC server, which is your gateway to the blockchain network, and then you have these computers called validators. And what validators are doing is they are competing for the right to process the transactions. So effectively, the doing is competing for the right to process the next block of transactions, or the transactions that arrive in the The way that they compete is complex and boring and differs between blockchains, and I don't think it was. All you need to know is that one computer wins the right to process the transactions in a block, and then it will process the transaction you sent as part of that block, and then it will write that block into the ledger. So the way it looks is you have, before each block, you have a state. The blockchain network has a state where all of the accounts have certain numbers in them. Then a bunch of transactions are processed within the block. Those that succeed are executed, and they're executed in the order that's determined by the validator. So that's one of the reasons people run validators, is you have the right to decide which order the transactions go in a block, so you can actually front run things. And that's a feature. That's part of what you benefit by paying compute costs of running a validator. So the validator decides the order that the transactions are processed in, and then it writes the block, and then that leads to the combined output of the block leads to a new state post that block. A lot of the time, what you'd really like to know as an analyst is what's the state at the end of each block. But actually, you can't get that from your RPC server. In order to have a server that can rewind the state to each individual block, you have to run something that's called an archive node. Archive nodes are massively computationally expensive to run, and huge amounts of memory, and it can take weeks or even months to sync a newly set up archive node to a particular blockchain, so that you can just step back and forth in time. But the complete ledger is available very easily, and you can request blocks in particular ranges, or even filter them for specific features that they may contain, so that you can fast forward and rewind the states of certain wallets for certain tokens. Okay, and then if you want to analyse transaction data, which is what we want to do, we want to see what's happening. It's even simple process. You just query the RPC server, and it's got the complete ledger within it, and you can pull down the blocks that you need to do analysis of those blocks. Okay, so now let's look specifically at transactions on Solana. So on Solana, there's this distinction between native and custom programs. So the token program is a native program on Solana. It provides all of the fundamental functionality associated with tokens. And that implements the transfer instruction, which is like the fundamental instruction for moving tokens between wallets. Tokens cannot move between wallets without going through the transfer instruction. But you can have a trading program built on a custom trading program, which implements a swap instruction, and that will call the token program twice with two different transfers. The transfer going in one direction, the transfer going in the other. So the transfers is where you can just see this moves from this to this, but it's the swap that tells you the meaning of these two transfers is that they are a pair and they are exchanging these things. So if you look at your data from your RPC server for native instructions, you get nice, readable, structured JSON data that tells you everything you need to know. So this is telling you someone's transferring 196,000 Trump coin. The mint is the address of the represents the token. The source is the wallet it's coming from. The destination is the wallet it's going to. Nothing. It's all completely open. Similarly, the other really important transfer native instruction is mint, and this is the instruction that minted Trump coin. That's saying mint 1 billion Trump coin. The mint is the address of the token. The account is where it's being minted into. The mint authority is the person, basically a wallet that's sending the transaction. And with just those two instructions, mint and transfer, we can map out the deployment of the Trump token. So it starts off on the 17th of January, the day before they launch it, they mint 1 billion. And we've called this account Origin because it's the starting point. Out of that billion, they put 800 million in this other account called Big Boy because it's got so much. Now, that 800 million was supposed to be, according to the official website, after 3 months, it was supposed to be incrementally rolled out into the marketplace, and that hasn't happened. It's still parked in Big Boy today, and nobody knows why. But then the remaining 200 million, most of it gets distributed into these three accounts, which we call T2 and Q. These names that we come up with for things are based on the first 3 or 4 characters of the hash, and that's because saying TX164 or 7QT, which is what Qt is, like, it gets really tiresome after a while, so we just give them all nicknames. So you get 100 million to T, 56 million to T, and 30 million to Q. And then what you can see is that all of them put almost all of it into this account that we call net. All of it goes from T, all of it goes from T, only 2 million goes from Q. But Nate looks different to the other accounts, because after the launch of Trump Coin, you can see thousands of accounts transferring Trump Coin in and out of Nate. So Nate is different in nature, and we can see that all of these movements of money, including the movements from T to Q, they're all, even though they're boiling down to transfer instructions, they're all actually instructions triggered by cross-program invocation from something called the Meteora DLMM program. And after a bit of reading, what you find out is that that's a program for running online, on-chain marketplaces. So you've got this account called Nate, it's got pools of 2 tokens, Trump Coin, which is the one they're selling, USDC, which if you don't know, it is a stable coin, which means it's backed 1-to-1 to the dollar. So the idea is that one USDC token is always guaranteed to be worth $1. Some of these stable coins occasionally come off their pegs, but from the point of view of accounting, you can regard that as real money. So we know this is a marketplace, and we can see money moving in and out. To understand the meaning of these moves, we need to know what the Meteora DLMM program instructions are doing. So you think, okay, well, I'll just go back to my transaction data from my RPC server and look up the Meteora instructions. I should be able to see what's going on. And you see that, and you think, oh crap, now what do I do? So it turns out this is a base 58 encoded string that represents a certain byte sequence. And the way it works, these custom program instructions work on Solana, is the first 8 bytes, if you decode the string to the bytes, every number here is 1 byte between 0 and 255. The first 8 bytes of any one of those encoded instructions is what's called a discriminator. It identifies the program instruction, and then the remaining bytes are the arguments that go to the instruction. So in the case of a swap, that's the discriminator for a swap on the DLMM program, the next 8 bytes are a 64-bit integer representing the amount in, the next 8 bytes after that are a 64-bit integer representing the amount out, and so on. And then the remaining bytes can be things like a single byte indicating which direction the swap's going in, the addresses involved, all kinds of things like that. But the key problem is, that the thing that sort of just crushed our souls when we saw it, is realizing that all of these byte sequences, they're instruction specific. So the way the data is encoded is specific to a particular instruction in a particular program, because there's no generic way of decoding this data. And that's the problem, because that's what we want. Ideally we want a universal decoding process, or we want at least a way of coming up with program-specific decoders quickly. So what are the requirements? Well, we need to find the description of the program's interface, its instructions and their arguments and their data structures. We need to map the discriminators to the plain English instructions so we know what's going on. And we need to map the byte sequences to the data structures to the instruction arguments. I need to say a little bit about tooling here. Up until this point, we've been doing everything in Python, because Python's fast to write and it's fast enough to run that we can work really quickly on very large data sets and process them quite efficiently. But Python's absolutely terrible for this task because there's no ecosystem for this work in Python. We're going to have to do all of this, but there are libraries we can use in Rust, because Rust is the language that is used to develop programs that are deployed on the Solana blockchain. So there's a whole bunch of tools available in Rust. So the approach that we took was, one, learn Rust. Once we learn Rust, get the program IDLs, the interface definition languages. These are problematic on Solana, they're not problematic on Ethereum, because they're all done to the standard on Ethereum. There are different versions of the IDL, and they all look a bit different. But you can at least find them for the overwhelming majority of programs on a website called SolidScan, which is a blockchain explorer. So we can at least get them. So write code generation tools to generate Rust types and decoders from the IDLs, and then write a Python package with bindings to the Rust decoder. So we've got to a point now where we can basically, it takes about an hour to come up with a decoder for a new Solana program that we haven't encountered before. That was quite a lot of work in a short amount of slides, but what that meant is that we could now unpack these Meteor DLM and coding instructions, we found there were 4 instructions that were really important to understand that diagram I showed you earlier. Add liquidity, that's the instruction whereby someone running a market puts tokens into the marketplace. Remove liquidity is when they withdraw the liquidity they previously provided, which means if you put in Trump tokens and they've been sold for USDC, you withdraw it as USDC. That's your profit for selling the tokens. Claim fee, you also, as the person running the market, get transaction fees on every trade within the market. So there's a separate instruction to claim fees on the trading taking place within the market, because you'll make profit from that even on secondary selling. And then the last one is swap, the ones that traders actually use to buy and sell into the market. Once we were able to decode these instructions, it becomes very clear what's going on with Net. All of those dashed lines between our 3 main accounts and the marketplace, every single one of those instructions is either add liquidity, remove liquidity, or claim fee. So any remove liquidity in USDC or claim fee in USDC, that's the money that we just need to have. And then all of these are swaps, people buying and selling. So this became our story. We could finally answer this question. The answer is $314 million in sales, $36 million in fees at the time we published the story. That we think they've made another 15 to 20 million in fees. I can't remember the exact amount since then, between the publication of the story and now. But in addition to being able to answer this question, which is what the editor wanted, we can find out all kinds of interesting things. So this is a chart of the liquidity inside the marketplace that was used to sell Trump coin. And you can see they start with the 100 million from Teak, and then Tooth. Yeah, it's Teak. And then very quickly, within 10 minutes, like 50 million of it's gone. And so these dashed lines show you where they're dropping in the liquidity to sort of sell through the tokens as the price is going up and the demand is surging. And on this, you know, they've done quite a good job there. It doesn't ever crash out, and you know they're topping it up. And then you look at the actual price chart, and you realise they missed out on a ton of money because the first 100 million. It gets hard to tell. Because once people start selling back into the market, it gets hard to tell like when the original stock's gone. But we could work out definitively when the first 100 million had gone, and they all sold for less than $1. And in fact, if you go back to this chart, the ones that sold here sold at substantially higher price per token than the ones here. So if they'd have managed it better, given that it went up to $75, they could have made vastly more money than they did. The other thing that's interesting is this huge price drop about 2 days afterwards. And the reason that happened is because of this. So Melania Coin launched their own meme coin, like within 48 hours of Donald Trump launching his. And the funny thing about Melania Coin is, we know it's run by a different team, and we know it was a rush job because the domain name wasn't registered till after Trump Coin launched, whereas Trump Coin's domain was registered in December. So Trump Coin was very carefully planned out, and then somehow, and this bit I'd love to know the detail on, this team run by a company called Calcia Ventures convinced Melania to launch her own coin. And when it launched, it caused confusion in the Trump Coin market, and it briefly spiked. Now, earlier on, I said that none of those 3 accounts did anything other than claim fees and add and remove liquidity, and that's not quite true. There was one time, just once, that any of those accounts actually bought money and intervened in the market, and it happened there. And they had to buy 1 million Trump coin at quite a high price in order to stop the market from collapsing. But it worked. Okay, I'm nearly done, but this is one more thing I want to tell you about Melania coin. So we thought after we'd done the Trump coin story, let's do the same to Melania coin. How much money did that make? And we found something interesting that we weren't expecting. So all of these coins, they're launched on Truth Social, both of them, which is Donald Trump's social network. And it's the first place that both of them are announced. And the interesting thing about Truth Social is it tells you the time at which the thing is published. And if you look in the JSON packet that's feeding that website, you can get the time down to the millisecond. So we know it happened at the 9 p.m., 10 minutes past 9, 50 seconds, and 536 milliseconds. That's when the first time the world knew that Melania coin existed. But if you look at the liquidity for the Melania on-chain marketplace, you can see people buying the coin in the 2 minutes 21 seconds before it was launched, and buying quite a lot of the coin. So 24 wallets purchased 16.7 million Melania coin in 2.5 minutes before it launched, worth $2.6 million. And then over the following days, they sold their holdings for $99.6 million. There was one account that bought tokens worth $680,000 and sold them for $43.4 million in 3 days. And we were able to, not that long, but we were able to directly link one of the wallets to Hayden Davis, who's the CEO of Galaxy Ventures, which was the company running the Melania coin launch. And Melania herself, the actual profits from liquidity and fees were only 64.7 million. So the snipers made more money than Melania did. Oh yes, you need that. Johnny ran the marathon.
Yeah, Johnny's going to sit down, I think.
I might start at the beginning, but I might sit down later on. Yeah. Hello. So after crypto, I'll now talk about elections, which me and Ollie and the rest of the team spent huge amounts of time on last year, because last year was the year of elections. There were lots and lots and lots of elections. The biggest two for our coverage were the British election and the US election. And here are some screenshots of our coverage, our homepage, on the night of the election. And so elections are primarily about counting things. So I figured that this was a good topic for math. So we do a lot of election coverage. It's very well read, it's very important. And so the main 3 things we do is poll tracking. So before the election, trying to predict what's going to happen. On the night when the votes are being counted, doing live results, and then after the election, sort of trying to analyse it, make sense of it all. So I'll talk really about the British election. So you may remember this, but in May, Rishi Sunak stood out in the rain, May last year, and announced that he was going to call an election. And he got very wet, and he said there was going to be, in 6 weeks, there was going to be the election. So we had a lot of work to do in a very short period of time, and lots of questions were arose, and they're sort of mathematical-ish, as in how many votes will each party win, how many seats will they win, and then sort of at a local level, who's going to win where in each constituency. Will the Labour Party, as they eventually did, win a majority? If so, by how much? How well will other parties do? But lots of sort of questions. And the main way we find out about this is through polling. So this is a sort of, stats 101. The way you try and estimate what's going to happen at a sort of national scale is you take a sample of, say, 1,000 people, and you ask them before the election, which party do you plan to vote for? And then once you've asked 1,000 people and they say, then you take the average, and then that's your guess. And as you probably know, that if you increase the sample size, it should get more accurate. But of course, this all relies that you actually find a random sample of the population, which is very, very hard to do, because you don't know who's going to vote, and sometimes people don't, people change their mind, and so on. But in general, if you ask 1,000 people across the country, whether you reach them by phone or online, or even just asking in person, you'll probably get pretty close. And so a whole industry has grown around this. In the UK, there's sort of 15 or maybe 20 polling companies, and sort of every week or every few weeks they ask 1,000 people, and who they're going to vote for, and then they publish these numbers, and then people on Wikipedia very nicely enter them into this table. And so this is the run-up to the British election. There were like dozens of polls being released, and each poll is subject to a bit of random noise, random error. There are also methodological choices, and so what we had to do was take these numbers and then find a way to average them. And so on the left there is our way of averaging them, and so we take into account that we give more weight to polls with high sample size, and then if one pollster is publishing lots and lots of polls, we downweight it. But anyway, so we come up with an estimate at each point in time for how much support each party has. But as you can see, it was relatively stable over the course of the campaign. But as soon as the election was called, Labour's polling actually started to drop. So fully enough did the Tory polling, and then Reform, which is Farage's party, started rising in the polls. But the issue is these national polls don't really tell you how many seats each party is going to win, because the UK's electoral system, we don't just count all the votes in the whole country and then a proportion seats based on that. Really, it's sort of 650 mini competitions. So each constituency is roughly equally sized. So I think here we're in. Yeah, Camden maybe. I don't know who the MP is here, but anyway. But this area will have one MP and the next constituency. The other will have a different MP, but it's basically 650 competitions. And whoever gets the most votes locally in that constituency wins the whole seat, which means there are a lot of sort of wasted votes, as in sometimes a party wins a lot of votes but almost no seats, or alternatively the other way around, a party doesn't win very many votes and wins lots of seats. So I've taken a screenshot of the 2015 election, I think, and so as you can see, the number of MPs they have, or the proportion of MPs they have, is quite different to the proportion of votes. So the Tories that year, the Conservatives got 37% of the vote, but they won 50.8% of the seats. So they had a majority, and they could do with it what they liked. Whereas on the other end, UKIP, UK Independence Party, run by Farage, got 12.6% of the votes, but just one seat. And so this relationship between votes and seats is not linear. It's not. It's very difficult to take national polling data and then try to guess the number of seats. And so that was the real issue, was that the election that just went was sort of one of the least proportional, as in the votes to seats relationship was very skewed. So, but luckily people have been thinking about this for a very long time, since at least 1945, because the British electoral system has been unchanged roughly since, I don't know, at least 100 years. And so, as early as 1945, a election specialist, David Butler, introduced the concept of national swing. And the idea was to basically take the change in polling nationally, and then, so if the Tories were getting, the Conservatives were getting 5% more nationally than they got last time, just add 5% on to every constituency. And then do that for each party, and then go, okay, who do you think is going to win in each constituency? This worked pretty surprisingly well, even though it's a very simple model. Like you're not really looking at local factors at all. But because back then most people, like Labour and the Conservatives, were the two dominant parties, and so just this simple swing model worked very well. And there are all these lovely graphics of people showing whether it's swinging to the left or right. And from 1945 right the way to like 2005, with a few exceptions, this model worked really well, and so there wasn't really a reason to any more complicated, because given that the polls themselves have some error, you know, as a rough rule of thumb, this was very good. But it's got much worse now, because now there's many parties, and there's regional differences, and voters are like sort of some of them vote more tactically, and there's a lot more. You know, as in Scotland now has a different dominant party, the Scottish National Party. So lots of things have changed, and so people have done research on this, that if uniform national swing worked, we would expect all of these dots to lie along this line, and they don't really. And so it's just sort of stopped working. So, and yeah, votes do not now move directly between the Conservatives and Labour. They might go to the Green Party or Reform or the Liberal Democrats, and they do it differently in different parts of the country, which then means when we publish this polling average, it's getting less and less useful for knowing how many seats each party is actually going to win. And also, at the last election, there was a big swing away from the Conservatives, but then not such a big swing towards Labour, whereas these things used to add up. And you get these strange predictions where you expect a party to win negative numbers of votes, or over 100% of the votes, which obviously the model is just very simple, so it breaks down. So we had a long think about this, how to deal with this problem. So like, can we do something more clever than just taking this national polling and applying it locally? And so one idea is, well, why don't we do a poll in each constituency? The problem is 650 constituencies, you probably want a sample size of around 1,000. Then you have to ask 650,000 people, and that's a lot of people, very expensive. And so there must be a better way of doing it without, I think it's huge exercise. And so the idea was to sort of model the flow of voters. So in each area, instead of just sort of adding up, go, where are previous Labour voters going now, where are previous Conservatives going now, and then to make a national picture, and then try and also apply it locally. And yeah, we don't want to commission a massive poll. Also because sometimes, like, people have tried this before, and they often, like, it's hard enough to find a random sample of the whole UK population. To find a random sample of people who live in the same area is also very tricky. So the idea was that, like, I thought, well, flow between things can be represented in a matrix. So this is an example of the matrix. So people who voted Conservative last time, you can see where they are, like, where they're going this time. So, you know, this is scaled so that it's 100 people. So you can think of these as a percentage. So if there were 100 people, 28 of them voted Conservative last time, and then 10 to vote Conservative this time. But then sort of 11 people who voted Conservative last time tend to vote Reform, and so on and so forth. And then, so you have this sort of strong diagonal of those are the loyal voters, so voters who haven't changed their mind from last time. And then you have sort of the various switches. And so the idea is to try and populate this matrix. And so there's something called the British Election Study, which is run by academics, and so not a private polling company. And they publish these very high quality sort of research surveys every 6 months roughly. And it's got a very big sample size, so 30,000. But instead of, you don't just get the headline number, you get like really detailed breakdown. So for every single person who answers the survey, you get like their postcode, what constituency they're in, how they voted last time, the time before that, how they plan to vote next time, demographic data, and so on. And it's like, it's sort of checked. So it's often the same people each time, and so it's quite common that people forget how they voted last time because they didn't like how it happened, like what happened afterwards. so even with 30,000 people, you only have about 50 people per constituency, which isn't enough to populate this matrix per constituency. But if you take similar constituencies, so like sort of neighbouring ones or ones that vote in a similar way, or you can add lots of different factors, but so for here you take this constituency and probably all the neighbouring ones, and maybe all the neighbouring ones there that probably vote Labour, and you take those and then you weight the responses by how similar their constituency is to this constituency. And so for London it works quite well because there's a lot of London constituencies and they tend to vote in a similar way. But the idea is you're only taking a sample from the similar constituencies because that tells you a lot more about how it's working locally. So like you don't really care how Scottish voters are voting if you're trying to predict how London constituencies are voting. That works pretty well because you're sort of capturing the regional variation. And so, yeah, there's first a national transition matrix, which is, you can visualize as this nice Sankey diagram flow chart. So you can see in 2019, 45% of people voted for the Conservatives, roughly. And based on polling, that sort of more than halved to 21%. And previously you'd expect that most of those people leaving would go to the opposition party, the Labour Party, but only actually sort of a chunk, yay big. Most of them were going to Reform, or the majority of the leavers were going to Reform. And then likewise, you had a lot of loyal Labour voters, but then you had a lot of Labour voters actually switching to the Green Party. But what was sort of the tricky part was that we could then do this at a local level, not just national. If I open a URL, do you think I'll be?
It should be fine.
And so in our methodology, you can look at all of the flow charts for all of the constituencies. And so there are some. I'll try to pick a normal-ish one for some definition of normal. Let's do a London one. I think this is a London one. So you can see like Labour doing well there, or like Westminster. But then there will be some, say Clacton, which Clacton was Nigel Farage's seat, and our model could sort of pick up Clacton and places like Clacton. People were abandoning the Conservatives in droves and moving to Reform, and like not very much moving to Labour. So whereas in London a lot of former Conservative supporters would move to Labour, in Clacton they were just going straight to Reform. And there are other interesting ones, I think Brighton. Brighton's a sort of green stronghold, and so you got some. So the Greens won 57% there at the last election, and they actually lost some vote share, I believe, to Labour. But still, probably, I think they won the seat. But the idea is that it looks very different in different parts of the country, and so uniform national swing just doesn't take into account. And then there's Scotland. So Inverness, maybe. Scotland's an entirely different setup again, where you have the SNP and the Scottish National Party, and voters there. The Scottish National Party are the incumbents, not the Conservatives, and so then you had some people moving to Labour, and you also had people moving to the Dems, some of them moving to the Conservatives. So it's a very complicated sort of flow that is hard to sort of represent, but this was the goal. So once we did all that, we could then make a sort of interactive tool so that you could enter what you thought the vote share was going to be, and it would sort of adjust these matrices for every constituency to predict the result. And so in that way, it would show the connection between vote share and seats. So this is the page we published a few weeks before the election, and the idea is if you think Labour won't win 40%, which they didn't in the end, you drag it down and you see how this affects their seat share. And there's a sort of non-linearity to everything where, so Reform, even though they went on this, we're assuming they get 16% of the votes. In the end, they got 14%, I think, something around there. The Republicans win sort of a handful of seats. In reality, they won 5, I believe. But as their vote share goes up, suddenly they win a few more, and a few more. But at some point, there's like a tipping point where they're the biggest party and they're stealing enough votes that they, it goes up quick, basically. And that's true for most parties. That like, if you're a small party between like 5 and 15%, you'll win very few seats, which is a bit frustrating. But once you get over that sort of 15 and then 20% threshold, here I'm doing the Greens, you just start winning everywhere. Because if you win 34% of the vote nationally, you're probably winning more than that in the seats you target. And so people enjoy it, playing with this, and this is very well on sort of social media because people were playing with it and seeing how it affects the result. And it's quite detailed. So if you drag the Greens up, you can actually see how well they'll do in each constituency. So I'll change it to the standard map. So here's map of the UK, and like as you drag these numbers around, you can see the map change. And then you can type in your postcode, and I can only think of my own postcode, so we'll do that. You type your postcode to see how different vote shares affect it locally. And so people use this actually for tactical voting because often people aren't really voting for a party, they're voting against a party they don't like. And they don't really care who wins so long as it's not them, whoever them are. And so using this you can play around with it and find out who is most likely. We did get quite a lot of people write in before the election to say you're wrong about my constituency, and we were like, well, yes, we will be wrong. We're not going to get every vote share right to 1 decimal place. Like that's too difficult to do. But it's meant to be sort of illustrative, and we'll trying the best we can with a lot of uncertainty. And there are a few quite persistent people who say, no, I disagree with you. And so there were a few constituencies that I really had long things about, and was like, do I have to change the model to account for this? And in the end I was like, no, it's the model as is. And in the end, quite often they were wrong. And their belief about who the opposition were didn't pan out. And because it's confusing, because there were also boundary changes between the elections, so everyone was living in a slightly different constituency. But the technical challenge of this is that all of this is running in the browser in JavaScript. And so every time you move one of these bars or press a button, 633 matrices are whirring away in the background and updating these flow diagrams. And it was very difficult because there was a bit of a worry that it was just going to be too slow. I spent a lot of time optimizing the code to make sure it runs. My phone's a bit slow, so it's not very good on my phone. But and this article is free to read, so if you want to play around with it, you can. And we also use this as like a test bed for our actual election results page. So this was published a few weeks before the election, but our election results page looked quite similar, but instead of projections, it was the real thing. And then, so how did it actually do? So we sort of came up with this model You can try and test it on previous elections, but every election is quite different. So it's very hard to know, and you can overfit to previous elections. So it was quite exciting on results night because every time a result came in and they announced the winner, I would check against the projection and go, oh, did we get it right? And someone on Twitter went through all of the different projections released by different companies or news organisations, and sort of he ranked them. And so this is the page for the FT. So we got 538 out of 631 correct. I was quite happy with, given that there was such massive swings involved, and it was our first time doing something like this. It was also nice because we didn't spend any money on this. We used publicly available data. Most of the competitors spent huge amounts of money asking 100,000 people. So, per pence, it's probably the best. And you can see that there are some places are easier than others. I think, Scotland is really hard because there's just the sample's just smaller and it's quite different. And also, we didn't predict any independents. So the 5 independent MPs won. Those are very hard to predict because that is an incredibly localized phenomenon. And so in a national poll, even with 30,000 people, the chance of you actually picking the right person who is voting for an independent, especially as a lot of those independents, no one had heard of them before, although they were quite unknown before the election. And so, and one of them was actually Jeremy Corbyn, because he was in the Labour Party last time, and so the model just predicts that most of those Labour voters will be loyal. But because Corbyn was left or was kicked out of the Labour Party and ran as an independent, he got most of the Labour voters. And so this is how it compares with other models. So it's vaguely middle of the pack. There's a lot of different ways people can predict elections, and there's a lot of different ways you can measure how well you've done. And so for seat totals, I think we've used the root mean squared error, and we got 16.2. And so Ipsos is a very famous pollster, and they didn't think this year, so they got 19.4, and lower is better. But Britain Predicts, out of the New Statesman, got the most accurate, and then Manifold is actually a betting market. So rather than doing any polling, it's based purely on how, for each constituency you could put a bet on who was going to win, and then what was predicted out of that was the Manifold one. And funnily enough, that actually did very well. Sometimes betting markets do manage to sort of internalize this information quite well, especially if a lot of people are betting on it. Sometimes they're terrible. It's a bit hit and miss. This time they did quite well. And then the exit poll is the thing that's announced on the night at 10 p.m. I don't know if any of you watched it. Big Ben strikes 10, and then they announce the exit poll. And the exit poll is done of people standing outside of polling stations and asking, who did you vote for? And so you don't have any sampling problems because you know everyone who voted. So it's a much better random sample. And then, on the correct sequels and on vote share, we did pretty well. But yeah, it's interesting that even the best one still got 10% of seats wrong. It's a difficult thing to do, and I think it's amazing actually that it works as well as it does, given how I think sort of 400 seats changed hands at the last election. It was the biggest change from one election to the next, maybe ever. Definitely in recent memory.